Hi, this is Eric Keller for Otoy. In this video, we're going to talk about some techniques you can use for working with VDB data within Octane Standalone. And the example we'll be using is this volcano scene that I've created, which is actually pretty simple and has kind of a nice kind of fiery plume coming out of the top. So we'll look at how to import VDB data into Octane and how to shade it using the volume medium node. But we'll also take a look at how you can create your own original VDB files using Houdini. All the files used to create this project are available for download if you'd like to take a look at them in Octane Standalone. So here's what the scene looks like in Octane Standalone. I'm using a sun and sky system for the lighting. I have some geometry that I sculpted for the volcano. So you can see it's kind of a decimated piece of geometry if I zoom in here. I'm using the PMC kernel for rendering, which is important because it affects how the cloud looks. For the ocean, I just have a simple deformed plane that I imported as an OBJ, and I put a specular material on it. And then what we're really going to take a close look at is this cloud right here, which is created using the VDB file that I imported. So you can see the tree for the scene itself is actually pretty simple. Aside from the camera node, the environment, the kernel, and the imager, all of the geometry necessary is contained within this small area right here. So we have our geometry group. I have the ocean geometry, the volcano geometry, and then this is the VDB file and the volume medium plugged into the VDB file, which creates the shading on the surface of the smoke here, as well as this little fiery bit right down here. So the VDB format itself was created by an independent group of developers. And if you want to learn more about the format itself, you can go to openvdb.org. So how do you get a VDB? Well, the easiest way to get a VDB file is to go to openvdb.org and go to the download section. And if you scroll down, you'll see that there are a number of free example scenes that you can easily download and start working with right away, including some nice explosions with fire and smoke and that kind of stuff. And of course, the files that I created for this project, you can download and work with as well. So to generate this smoke and fire, this fiery eruption that you see here, I actually used Houdini. And believe it or not, it's not that hard to do. And I'm by no means a Houdini expert. So I'm going to take you very quickly through that process of creating a VDB and exporting it as a sequence from Houdini, just so you get a little bit of a sense of how to work with this file format. So to create the effect in Houdini and export it as a VDB sequence, what I did is I brought in my volcano geometry using file, import, brought in the geometry, and that gives me a nice place for position and scale reference. Then I created a tube object by clicking on this button here on the shelf, and I placed that tube within the caldera of the volcano and kind of scaled it down so that it would fit neatly within there. And then with the tube object selected, I went up to the shelf, the Pyro Effects shelf, and up here there are a number of presets that you can use for quickly generating effects. Luckily for me, there happens to be a volcano preset. So with the tube selected, I clicked on the volcano preset, and it added a number of nodes to the scene to automatically generate that volcano effect using the tube object as a source. So when I play the scene, you can actually see I have this animated explosion coming out of the volcano. So to actually export the VDB sequence from Houdini, I need to go to Pyro Import. And within this node, you'll see Import Pyro Fields and Import Pyro Visualization. I'm mostly concerned with the Import Pyro Fields node. What I need to do is I need to connect a converter to this node. So if I pull up the tab menu and type in Convert, I can find Convert VDB right here. Click on it to add the node, and then add the input right here. And then to this node, I need to attach a file node. All right, so this is just a duplicate of what I've already done here. So the file node tells Houdini where to put the VDB sequence and what to include in it. So if I take a look at the Convert node, I need to set the Convert to menu to VDB because that's what I want to output. And this will add a few more options right here, which I can leave these at the default. And then I want to tell Houdini what I want to include as part of the VDB sequence. And to do that, I can use this menu right here, and you can see here are some of the options that are included in the simulation. So I'm going to keep things simple, and I'm just going to choose density and temperature. And once I have that set up, I'll go down to the file node. I'm going to set the file mode to write so that it writes the files to disk, and then open up the file browser to choose where I want to put the sequence. So the sequence itself, I'm going to give the name plume.$f. This tells Houdini that I want to export a file sequence as opposed to the current frame. Then the file format is going to be VDB. And then to choose the number of frames that I'm going to do, all I need to do is play through the simulation. So I set my timeline to 70 frames because I felt like that was enough. And then all I need to do with the file node selected is rewind and play the scene from the beginning. And as it plays the scene, it's going to write the VDB files to disk. And that's all I need to do to export the VDB sequence from Houdini. So Houdini has finished writing all the files to disk. So here's where you can see them. And I've put them into a folder called a VDB sequence. And again, you can download this so that you can import it into your project as well if you're following along. So now that we've created our VDB sequence from Houdini, let's see how we can bring it into Octane Standalone. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go into the node graph that I already have, and I'm just going to disconnect this VDB system from my geometry group. So my geometry group just contains the sea geometry and the volcano at the moment. So then I'm going to right click in the node graph editor and look for geometry and choose volume. So click on that. It's going to open up a file dialog, and I'm going to choose Plume 70 for now, just a single frame. And it's going to give me some options right here. I can leave these at the default because these can always be changed a little bit later. Since I used a low-res version of the volcano geometry in my Houdini scene, this should come in the right scale and the right placement. So I just need to hook this into my geometry group, which is already hooked into my render target. And we'll see that the volume appears kind of as a big blob of black smoke. There it is. So now that I have it in the scene, I need to add my volume medium to it so we can start shading it. So I'm going to right click again in the node editor, and I'm going to go to medium, and I'm going to choose volume medium. And then I'll attach this to my plume sequence. Now I'm not going to see much of a change just yet because I have all the settings at the default. So at this point, let's play with the settings and see what we can come up with. First thing I want to do is maybe play with the density a little bit. The default setting 100 is pretty high. So if I start to lower this, you can see that immediately my density changes from a thick cloud of smoke to something that's a little bit more thin and wispy. That's with the density of 0.022, so that's pretty low. Sometimes when you bring in a volume medium, if it's a very small scale or a low density, you might not see it until you actually raise the density. So this is usually the first setting that I start to play with. Let's set this to 1 for the moment and see how that looks. Looks pretty good. The next thing I want to do is work with the absorption, scattering, and the phase. So the absorption is already set up to a fairly light color. I'm going to go down to the scattering and bring this value up as well. So both of these control how light reacts when it strikes the volume or when it passes through the volume. So as the name suggests, the absorption controls how the light is absorbed by the volume, and the scattering controls how the light bounces around within the volume. So you can actually, if you wanted to color your smoke, you could actually use these to add different colors to the smoke and get something, you know, a little bit more I guess artistic. But let's leave these at grayscale colors for the moment. I'll put these close to white or a very light gray. So now let's take a look at the phase setting. So the phase setting shifts the scattering effect either to the back of the volume or to the front of the volume, depending on the value that you put in the scattering direction. Negative values will force the scattering effect to go to the back of the volume. And you're going to see, in this case, it's going to make the smoke a little bit grayer and look kind of more lightweight. And we don't see nearly as much detail on it as well. If I take the phase and I start to move it towards a positive value, towards 1, we get the opposite. Now we get more of a forward scattering effect. So as the light hits the front of the volume here, because the sunlight's coming from over here, you can see how it's scattered in the front of the volume, and we get a lot more detail. So it just depends on the kind of smoke effect that you're going for. So I'm going to leave this maybe at a scattering of, say, something like 0.672 or something like that. The volume step length attribute, which is a way to kind of increase the resolution of the volume. But you have to keep in mind lower settings are going to increase the resolution, higher settings are going to decrease it. And that is going to have an effect on rendering time. So if I start to bring this up, you can see that again, now we get something that's very lightweight and very thin and doesn't have a whole lot of detail. So if I bring this down to below the default setting of 4, be careful when you're adjusting this because it can really slow down the rendering. But you see we get a lot more detail and the volume effect looks a lot more substantial as well. So by balancing density, absorption, scattering, phase, and volume step length, you can see you can already design the look of the smoke. And keep in mind I'm still using that same Volcano VDB that I created in Houdini. So the VDB hasn't changed at all, but you can see I'm getting a wide variety of different effects depending on those settings. So what I like to do next is to create kind of a glowing fire effect. Sort of something that looks like suggesting that there's a hot pool of magma below the smoke somewhere. And I can do that using the emission attributes of my volume. But let's first, before I do that, let's take a look at the settings for the volume. I'm going to click on this little wrench icon here, which brings up our import settings for the volume. And I want to pay attention to these grids right here. So these are the grids that I exported from Houdini when I created that VDB sequence. So you remember I created density. In this version I created density, temperature, and heat. So I can actually use these to determine how it's going to map these colors and these various attributes to the volume based on this data. So for the emission, I want to set this to temperature. Let's set that to temperature. If your volume is at a completely different scale, you might want to use the scale attributes here to adjust to that accordingly. I'm going to leave them at the default settings of 1 for the moment. So I'll just click OK on that, and then I'm going to go into my volume medium node here, and under emission, let's add a texture emission. So I'll add texture emission, and as you can see, it immediately goes to white. The emission itself is a dark gray, so this is a pretty bright plume of smoke. So maybe we can adjust this by lowering the power. I'm going to set the power to 1, so that looks a little bit more reasonable. Now, of course, I can adjust the color of the medium using this texture. I'm going to leave this at a grayscale value, and instead I'm going to add the red color using a volume gradient. So I'll go down to the emission ramp option, and under no node, I'm going to choose volume gradient to add a gradient node. You can also, of course, right-click in the node editor, just as I was doing before, and go into, say, the medium and add a volume gradient this way. Either way, if I add a volume gradient here, it's going to override this one. But let's just keep it nice and simple for the moment. And I can add some colors to this ramp. So my start value, I'm going to set this to a very dark orangish red. Maybe even bring it down a little bit. And you can see as I bring the color down, we see less of it there in the smoke. And then on my end value, I'm going to leave it black. And in fact, I think I'm going to add another color marker in here so that I can push this red color even further down. So click on this plus button to add a new color. It's going to add a default white color, but let's set this to black. And then I can use this position to kind of squish this down a little bit, or I can just drag right here. The more narrow I make the gradient here, the more it pushes that red glowing color deep down within the volume. You can also experiment with turning on surface brightness and some of the other settings, but for the most part this looks pretty good, close to what I would like. And then of course I can always go back and start to make more adjustments to the volume medium node to kind of design how that fire works within the smoke plume. The last thing I want to talk about is how to bring in a sequence, because right now we just have the last frame in the sequence, which is plume.70.vdb. So if I go into the node inspector, I'll click on this little film strip icon, and this will bring up my volume animation options. So what I want to do is click on Add Files, and I'll select 1 through 70 of my VDB sequence and choose Open. And I'm going to leave animation mode to once, starting frame at 0, frames per file at 1. It's going to automatically set the total frames to 70, and it's at 24 frames per second. So if I click OK, if it's not already there, you will see a timeline appear right here. And so if I change the point on the timeline, you'll see that my cloud here is getting sucked into the volume because we're going backwards in time. So if I go down to frame 10, you can see now it's just a very young plume of smoke just being born into the world. So it's tucked down there in the caldera, and as I move this along, you'll see that it grows and comes out of the volcano. It's very dramatic. If we take a look at the end of the sequence, return to our big plume of smoke there. So in some of the images that I created using this animation, I added a second VDB sequence just for the kind of clouds that surround the volcano, kind of suggesting maybe steam coming out of the water. So I'll leave that as a challenge for you to figure out. And we'll revisit this scene in the future and talk about how we can add things like spewing glowing magma and all that kind of fun stuff to our little effect sequence here.